Have you ever wondered how Ice Age beasts became so massive? And then, what happened to them? Why aren't they around anymore? Today, I'm talking to our paleontology lab manager, Colin Diggins, who specializes in the Ice Age, about the giant ground sloth known as Eremotherium and the giant armadillo known as Glyptodon. Both animals seemed literally too big to fail, which makes the actual story of their life and demise truly mind-blowing. I'm your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger. This is the HMNS Beyond Bones podcast. Come chill with Colin and I for a truly fascinating conversation in the Ice Age section of our Morian Hall of Paleontology at the Houston Museum of Natural Science. Are we rolling? So welcome to the HMNS Beyond Bones podcast. I'm here with Colin Diggins, the man with the perfect last name to be a paleontologist. He is our paleontology lab manager here at the Houston Museum of Natural Science. We are standing in front of our giant sloth replica, and it is a replica.
Yeah,
correct?
This one is going to be a cast replication.
And you can tell because it's not being held up with jewelry mounts and scaffolding and things like that.
In fact, if you look super close into a few places, like where the femur is attached back into the pelvis, you can even see the bolts that hold the framework inside the cast together.
Now, would this be considered a research grade replica?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly at least museum grade. It's fabulous for display, but I use this for comparisons all the time. If we find elements that we think may belong to one of these giant ground sloths, it's basically my go-to comparison because it's a lot easier than having to look at photographs.
And we are going to talk about this giant ground sloth and some armadillos. We're going to talk about the size of these creatures, when they died, maybe how they died. But you brought up an interesting point that leads me to a really good question.
Sure.
When we talk about museum grade, research grade,
yes,
or obviously authentic fossils, what is the difference between, we'll start with the basic, an authentic fossil, and then what does it mean to be research grade, and then what does it mean to be, museum grade?
So I'm not going to say that this is the end-all, be-all definition for these terms, right? But of course, the authentic original fossil usually means that at least some of the elements included in the mount are going to be the actual fossils themselves, the original material that's been replaced. It's not the actual bone of the animal, but the nature's perfect copy made out of stone. For research-grade casts, these are going to be replications made from the original fossils that are so detailed and so accurate, you can more or less study those themselves. When I use the term museum grade, usually what I mean is that these are cast from original material, but the material may have been reconstructed. It may not have been a perfect cast, so it's certainly good enough for display and it is accurate, but it may not have that level of detail, that extra little bit of just that precision that you need to actually study it rather than looking at the original.
So as you mentioned that, I'm thinking of Y-Rex's toe.
Yes.
So Y-Rex has some of the best preserved T-Rex feet in the world, if not the best preserved T-Rex feet in the world.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so since it's so rare, since the T-Rex feet are so rare and it's so well preserved, we have the actual toe in this instance safely somewhere else.
Absolutely.
But since it's within arm's reach of the public,
we can't put the original material out necessarily, yeah.
But correct me if I'm wrong, the toe that we do have out in this instance is research grade.
Absolutely.
Because, and I'll put some B-roll in here too, of the replica toe or the research grade replica toe and the real toe, because we had it on site for a while back. But there's a fissure that's going through the fossilized material, and that exact same fissure is in the research grade replica.
Absolutely.
So in scenarios when it's too risky to lend off the only Y-Rex toe in existence, you can have the research grade replica and derive a ton of information from the research grade replica.
Yeah, and handle it in a way that you really can't handle the original. It's it's the sort of thing that you have to be a lot more careful with a fragile actual fossil than you can be with a replica. If I drop one of those replicas, it might break, but of course we can make another one, right? You can't replace the original material if it gets broken, more or less. You might be able to get it reconstructed. It's never going to be exactly the same, though. I've just been working on a reconstruction today that's not quite exactly as it was when it started, but that's the nature of working with fossils.
I mentioned in a previous podcast when we discussed fossil preparation, which is an excellent podcast. I will link it in the description of this podcast. If you haven't heard it or seen it, it's also on YouTube. Go watch that where we talk about, we were in the Green River
formation, all those fossils, like the fish scales, the mind-numbing process it is to bring out the detail and prep like fish fossils. But I mentioned in that podcast, a femur of a barosaur or something like that. That's not super fragile. And you were very quick to be like, well, it may be pretty rigid, but you don't be like tossing it to your colleague or something like that. It still needs to be protected and everything like that. So let's get back on the topic of giant ground sloth.
My favorite.
And we'll go over probably to the giant armadillo. We are in what section of the Paleo Hall?
Yeah, so technically this is the Pleistocene. Most folks refer to this as the Ice Age section, which isn't a technical term, but it's a good kind of descriptor, right? It's what most folks are familiar with. If you've seen the movie Ice Age, you've probably seen some of these animals in there.
Right. So this giant ground sloth, obviously it has descendants and relatives today, the sloths that we know and love and are super cute and hang from trees, and they come down to poop, and then do they come down to poop, or is it just to eat?
Yeah, that's sloths.
They come down to poop.
And they spend most of their time eating up in the trees.
Do you know why that is? Why? Y'all can come through, y'all are good. Yeah, don't worry about us.
Don't let us rush you either.
I can edit around this, it is totally okay. But why do you know why do they come out of the trees to do their business?
That's a really good question, and it's one that I don't think wildlife biologists today have all settled on the same answer. There's a lot of different hypotheses, there's a lot of different ideas, right? But I don't think there's just one explanation that everybody agrees on. I know I was watching a video on this recently, and there were just some discussions about not spreading their feces around in a way that might then indicate to a predator their general area, but that concentrating it in one place might help them to hide it. There's this other really interesting discussion that coming down to the forest floor in order to defecate, in order to do their business, may also be one of those areas in which they're sort of coming into contact with the algae that are sort of symbiotic and live within their fur. That might be one way they kind of inoculate themselves and pick up that material, then bring it back and it grows in their fur, but they live in the canopy. But there's a few different hypotheses as far as I remember, but I'm not necessarily a specialist in living sloths. I tend to focus more on the extinct ones.
Right, so let's talk about the dead ones.
I do want to make a little distinction there. These guys do not have any living descendants. The small ones do not come from these big ones. These guys, totally extinct. They're gone. I'm very sad to say, believe me, I'm crushed. But at the time these guys were alive, the small ones were living too. And the small ones are the surviving members of a much larger family. These guys, unfortunately, are extinct. And then what we mean by that is that they have no living descendants.
And would one of the reasons why the small ones have survived is because the small ones did live up in trees and
they're a lot harder to get to for predators. I mean, also, if you think about if one of the big predators that may have helped drive these to extinction is humans, there's a lot more meat on these big guys than there is on those little guys. So the effort is really worth it on these, whereas all the time it would take you to maybe catch or kill a sloth, but it's the small guys that live up in the trees would be maybe not really worth all that time and effort.
Did you or anybody watching ever play Oregon Trail? That seems like of course we played Oregon Trail. I grew up in the late 80s and 90s, so like there might be kids today that grew up maybe not playing it on their iPads and things like that. Y'all youngins, I'm just gonna yell at the cloud for this podcast. But in Oregon Trail, you leave the trail to go hunt. And you walk around in your Pixely. I played on an old Macintosh 2, whatever. And
taking down a bison would feed everybody, right?
Exactly. A bison comes lumbering in. You want the bison versus
you have to
wasting
kill so
bullets,
many rabbits to try and feed somebody.
And things like that. So that makes total sense that our ancestors would have hunted this because there's way more meat on this guy.
Preferentially, they would have preferred to hunt this guy, I'd say. Not to say that we haven't put pressures on living ground sloths as well, especially through habitat loss.
I mean, if we were walking by and there's a tree sloth on the ground pooping, hey guy, maybe they got picked off while they're coming down to poop. And maybe they don't come out of the trees very often because they didn't want to be
and that's part of it too, actually sloths have, all sloths, right? And actually they're part of a bigger super order called Xenarthra, which include things like armadillos, have really slow metabolisms. So sloths actually hold it for like a week or something absurd like that before they make their way down to the ground to actually defecate. So they only go once in a blue moon, so to speak. But that also does help to decrease the amount of risk, right? The amount of time they spend down there on the ground, the forest floor. One thing I wanted to mention too is that Eremotherium here is part of the biggest ground sloths, the family called Megatheridae, but there's 4 different families of giant ground sloths. So while Eremotherium here was the biggest, we've got Paramylodon that was smaller, Megalonyx, which is smaller than that, and Northrotheriops, which is even smaller than that, which are still huge compared to the surviving sloths, but not nearly as big as Eremotherium here. And we've lost all of the ground sloths. The tree sloths are the only ones that have survived to today.
So, speaking specifically about Eremotherium here, where would he have lived?
Yeah, so he's not climbing trees like today's tree sloths, right? It's implied in the name, ground sloth. He lives on the ground. Now, we think he's using these big claws, these big arms to reach up and pull down vegetation so he can get it to his mouth. He can chomp on that happily, which is why he's sitting up like this right now. He's got his tail on the ground so he can use that as a tripod to kind of rest nicely. But when he's walking around, when he's moving from stand of trees or bushes, because he's probably primarily a browser, he's probably mostly eating leaves, he's probably doing that mostly on all four legs.
Would Eremotherium's bones by now be fossilized in the way that a Stegosaurus would be fossilized?
It kind of depends. So because these guys were around so recently, you can find them here as much as 10 or 12,000 years ago, some of those are not going to be mineralized very well. I mean, they will have lost a lot of the collagen, a lot of the organic material from the bone, but it may still be the original apatite or the inorganic component of the bone, and it may not have had much of an opportunity to absorb minerals from the ground around it. But you can find elements from these guys because they were, around for a few million years that are absolutely hard as glass and very well mineralized as well. It just really depends on the conditions of their burial more than anything.
Right. Where do we typically find Eremotherium specifically?
These guys are found all across North and South America. So they were found all across the continental U.S. I know there was one of the four families of ground sloths that made it to Alaska. I don't think it was Eremotherium. I want to say it was one of the smaller, like Megalonyx, that made it up there. It may have been Paramylodon. I'm not remembering off the top of my head. But I know these guys were all across North America. The family of their group originates in South America. They were present down there as well. But they never really make it over to Europe or the Old World because they originally evolved in South America and kind of migrated north here to North America. As soon as the Isthmus of Panama formed, more or less. And even actually probably a little bit before that, because a lot of these sloths were actually really good at swimming. And I say we had four families of ground sloths in North America. If we're including the Caribbean, there's actually five, because there was a whole group of sloths just indigenous to the Caribbean islands as well, which is super cool too.
So why... I'm glad you mentioned the Isthmus of Panama. I brought that up in a separate, I can't remember if it's a podcast or if it's, I do a lot of videos of things for the museum.
Too many subjects
but
to cover.
I found an actual, depiction of the formation or whatever of it's basically a land bridge that formed. So now that creatures from South America could migrate their way up to North America.
Yeah, and there's this whole big exchange of stuff that was living in North America heading south, stuff living in South America heading north. There was this huge exchange of animal and plant communities at that time because of that land bridge forming.
And I can't remember if maybe it was the sloth. I think it was.
These are one of the
I think you mentioned or somewhere it mentioned where these big guys came up the Isthmus of Panama and they were met with saber-toothed tigers, and it didn't really end. They met with humans, and
that may have been a video
tigers.
with James, but yeah, that is a really cool. Like, of course, we had things like Smilodon and stuff like that living up here. So of course, these animals were probably meeting for the first time.
They walked to the metaphorical wrong side of the tracks.
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah. Some big bad predators on the north end, yeah, for sure, without a doubt.
And so, how did Eremotherium evolved to be so big?
Oh, that's a really good question. I mean, certainly their ancestors were much smaller. We, in fact, think that those earliest ancestors of those Anarthrans were probably subterranean. They probably lived underground. We actually even think some of these larger ground sloths may have dug burrows to live in, because, of course, they're too big to climb up into the trees to live there. So one place to sleep that's really nice and safe in a burrow underground.
Yeah.
But we think their earlier ancestors may have spent time essentially mostly living underground, hunting things like insects or eating tubers, almost more like a gopher or something like that.
I was just going to say that being underground probably helped the survival.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, that was definitely a good survival strategy for their earlier ancestors and for the bigger ground sloths as you say, got larger. So the big question you asked there, I wanted to get back to was, how did they get bigger, right? And of course, it's a thing over time, right? Especially in South America, where there may not have been that many truly massive predators. There were some pretty big birds, the Phorus rakids, that were certainly, we think, probably predatory. May have been omnivorous, but I think they're probably at least taking some meat, partially carnivorous, right?
Yeah.
So if you got these big predators, one thing is you kind of have sometimes is an arms race, you might say, where if you got big predators, it helps to get bigger as a prey species as well. If you look at modern elephants, their ancestors way back in the day were much smaller as well, but getting bigger helps them to defend themselves, fight off other species. And then also, you know, another advantage too is if you're living on the ground and huge, you can reach more food higher up. It's the same thing with the big long neck of the brontosaurs or the longer neck of, say, something like a giraffe. The big long arms of the Eremotherium here are definitely going to help him to reach vegetation that other animals are not necessarily going to be able to. I mean, maybe some of the things like the gomphotheres or the mastodons, which have those long trunks, can try and browse kind of high up. But yeah, with him standing more or less straight up and reaching, I think he's probably going to be able to outreach any of those elephants or their relatives, rather.
Reach up for the good fruits hanging in the trees, all the really nutritious stuff.
I mean, they probably, I'm sure, enjoyed fruit. Their diet was probably primarily composed of things like leaves and twigs, though, believe it or not, which seems like very low value food, but you know, these guys have that big capacious gut they need for fermentation, right, to be able to break down that plant material.
Yeah.
And they can certainly shovel a lot of it down, and with that slow metabolism, they can stretch it pretty far, too.
Right. And there's such an issue. You mentioned, I think a minute ago, this kind of arms race between animals to get bigger, to reach the food, whatever, but also subsequently
to fight off predators.
Fight off predators, but also the plants that they are trying to eat. One reason I've heard that trees got bigger and bigger is to get away from reach of these animals that are
the things
getting
coming
bigger
around
and bigger.
constantly ripping off their leaves and stealing their photosynthetic capacity. It's in arm's reach between the plants and their herbivores.
There's a theory that I've heard tossed around since I was a kid, actually. And I remember as a kid thinking, oh, that actually makes a whole lot of sense. But I want to ask you this.
Absolutely.
The theory is that one reason why these creatures, Eremotherium and bigger dinosaurs and things, because not all dinosaurs were big giant things. Like we're very small. But one aspect of our planet that allowed them to get so big was that we had a more oxygen-rich atmosphere. Have you heard that, or can you speak to that?
That is true, depending sort of maybe on the time period we're talking about and what sorts of animals, right? If we're talking about insects, arthropods living back during the Carboniferous, that makes a huge difference, yes. When we're talking about things like Eremotherium, not so much.
Okay.
Yeah. And so like with Eremotherium here, he's living in a time period very recently, right? I mean, 2.5 million years ago sounds like a long time to you or me, maybe, but geologically speaking, yesterday, especially 10,000 years ago, right? Oxygen levels were really not that different 10,000 years ago. They're pretty much exactly the same as they are today.
Right. And so, how do we know that?
How do we know that?
Ice samples and
oh
things?
Yeah, ice cores are a great way to get a look at the oxygen. Sometimes they can even do things like looking at, oh gosh, I'm sorry, now I'm thinking about other isotopic analysis. I was gonna say lake sediments as well, but those are generally, if they're still sediment, gonna be recent enough that we're looking at, again, Ice Age, sort of Pleistocene stuff. But I think it's primarily done through ice cores. Maybe also,
tree rings?
Oh gosh, I'm trying to remember. Ryan is going to be a much better person to answer that question for you than I am, honestly.
I'm sorry to throw you off.
That's all right. You know, they come up organically as we're going throughout. But tracking oxygen rates throughout time, I mean, I know certainly when we're looking at things like the great oxygenation event in the beginning of Rohal, the presence of all that rusty iron implies the first sort of increase in oxygen levels. I know in the Carboniferous, the increases in oxygen levels had a lot to do with those massive coal swamps that were forming, essentially these huge forests that were cropping up, sucking carbon out of the atmosphere in order to build these plant bodies, dying and not decaying, but instead just being buried and locking and sequestering that carbon away, leading to much higher levels of oxygen in the atmosphere. But I know that crashed post the Carboniferous when there was sort of a massive ecological collapse there as well, so that oxygen levels had decreased significantly compared to the Carboniferous by the time we even hit the Permian period, which is before even dinosaurs show up. And while I know there were fluctuations in oxygen levels after that as well, they were not necessarily ever as severe, was not necessarily as high a levels as we ever got to in the Carboniferous, say during the time period of the dinosaurs.
Right.
But no, the oxygen levels, that I think has more to do with the geochemistry, which is admittedly something I am incredibly weak on. I'm much better with the biology and the anatomy.
But you mentioned, these things died off over 12,000 years ago or so, like in a blink of an eye in the geological scale.
Very
these guys
recently.
were here yesterday.
People got to see them.
Right.
Which is always
Human
the thing
beings
that blows
got
my
to see
mind.
them and draw them, and
and maybe hunt them as well.
Hunt them,
yeah,
exactly.
Because we got evidence of that in White Sands, where they've got the trackways from these guys followed along by trackways of people, and we can see from these that they were periodically moving on those four limbs, stopping, turning around, raising up on those hind two limbs, probably saying, "Hey, back off, man!" Because again, look at these big old claws. That's another arms race there. If you want to fight off predators, that's probably going to help.
So here's my whole hand. I'm about 6'1". The middle claw is
way
like 2 or 3
big
times as big as my whole hand. And this thing rears up on me. I'm
and of course,
twice.
because there's also then fingernail, more or less, the actual claw. This is just the bony core on the inside.
Oh, exactly.
When you look at different animals, they can sometimes be almost a third again as long as the bony core underneath. So these are much smaller compared to the actual thing that's going to be hitting
Those are depicted. There's a mural over here. You can see them depicted. Just so picture, like, you think that bony core is big. Picture the extension of the keratin or whatever.
almost
off the end
twice
of it.
as long.
It's just giant swords on the thing of this beast. Back to oxygen levels and how one way I like to do these podcasts because I get to put 2 and 2 together and then ask an expert if he thinks it holds water or whatever. Eremotherium is massive.
Truly.
And so this theory that oxygen levels were higher back then. That's one reason why animals could get really big. All that, but Eremotherium is massive. We still have large animals. Today.
Absolutely. Elephants,
the
grizzly
blue bear.
whale.
The blue whale is the biggest creature to ever exist on her. I'm sure there's like fungi and
Right, a single individual animal rather than like a multi-colonial organism, you might say. Yeah, there's some stands of aspirin trees, I'm sure, that can outcompete a blue whale, but
that blew my mind when I realized that fact years and years ago. Was
absolutely
the biggest animal to ever live in the history of Earth is a mammal
today,
and it's a blue whale, and it's still here today. Yeah, hundreds of tons. Like, these things are giant. But my point is, oxygen. It was similar in one way. We know that is because even 12,000 years, which is the blink of an eye on the geological scale, horses certainly lived back here.
They originate here in North America, spread to the rest of the world, and go extinct here. Right. Actually, in fact, I should say they go extinct. And I don't know if. Oh gosh, you're now testing me. I'm going to say something. I'm not sure if it's correct.
You're
I don't
testing
know if
yourself.
Horses, I'm pretty sure horses. Yeah, I'm fairly certain horses made it to South America and also went extinct there as well. They go extinct all across the Americas and only survive in Eurasia. And we're going to check me on that later. And if we need to, we'll go ahead.
Certain species of horses, not obviously we have wild horses.
Yeah, not the domestic horse today or the wild horses.
And if you've ever stood next to it, like, there's a horse where we think of a cowboy riding a horse. Then there's Clydesdales, which are like many hands. Taller
massive.
And they're absolutely massive.
Well, and then if you put
creatures.
those up against a Dartmoor pony, which is a relatively small animal compared to even the cowboy's horse, But of course, the horses have had that much diversity and more in the past as well.
Exactly. They've been here for a long time, and they're technically still.
But now I'm forgetting why you even brought up horses to begin with. I interrupted
because
you.
horses are big animals, and they lived alongside giant ground sloths. I was going to ask about the armadillo.
Yes. Shall we move over there, or do we want to just talk about it from more over here?
If we talk more about the Eremotherium, we'll come back over to Eremotherium. Let's go over to our giant armadillo and talk about that creature.
So what this guy is right here is a Glyptodont, right, which is kind of a pretty big group related to the modern armadillos. Obviously you can see he's got the armored shell on the outside, kind of like our modern armadillos. One big difference, however, with these guys, we don't think they could roll up into a ball. They don't have any of those bands in the middle that would allow their shell to actually flex or sort of shift like our modern armadillos do.
I just now put 2 and 2 together. You look at a modern armadillo, and I'll put some B-roll over it, but it has those bands in the shell, and you've seen modern armadillos, kind of like a roly-poly.
Fold up to protect themselves, This is
just this is thousands of plates.
Individual little bony plates called osteoderms. Now these are pretty well fused together. They're ankylosed. So they actually go to, they have these really neat little sutures where each one of those little margins meet, and they kind of almost like Legos, you might say. They kind of interlock together, and so they're very, very strong and pretty immobile. Now, of course, these are also kind of embedded in the skin as well. So as you're looking at these, you might notice these big little dimples in there, and those are the sites where we have hair follicles actually growing through as well. And then on top of that skin, there would have also then been kind of like the sheaths on the claw of the armadillo, a little bit of keratin, kind of like we think on an armadillo scute today, we see the same thing where there's a bony structure underneath in the skin, and then on top of the skin is that sort of almost like a fingernail, the scute on the outside.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, so, and then surrounding each one of those scutes would have then been hair. So this guy really had a wild appearance, you might say.
In relation to Eremotherium, where we just were, did they live together?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Same time period, more or less the same sort of environments. I mean, obviously, these guys are not eating the same sorts of things, right? If we look at the teeth of the ground sloths, and actually we look at their dung too, they're coprolites, we see a lot of leaves and twigs and things like that. If you look at the teeth of the Glyptodon, they've got very flat teeth that resembles more modern grazers. So I suspect these guys are eating a lot more grasses and some of the lower vegetation, which again, Eremotherium's got those huge big arms to be able to pull down leaves and things like that. This guy's, he's got some movement with his neck there, right? But he's not reaching very high up, and he's also probably not rearing that huge shell up very much. Again, because he's got this huge, beautiful, big spiked club tail at the back, which I'm sure has some beautiful side-to-side movement. But it's probably not functioning like the tripod tail of the big ground sloths.
It definitely doesn't look like he's designed to.
He's not as flexible. And when we look at his skeleton, there's a lot of fused elements in there, right? A lot of these bones that normally would allow movement are completely immobilized. So again, it shows he's got plenty of movement in the limbs, in the neck, the tail, but inside that big shell, not a ton of movement. His vertebrae don't move a whole lot.
Similarly to a turtle, could he kind of could he hunker his skull back into his shell a little bit?
Not really, not to my understanding. Well, I mean, to a little bit, yeah. He can probably pull his head back. He's got actually probably bony plates on the top of his head as well.
Yeah.
They don't show up on arm mount, but they, again, would have been in the skin. So they tend to fall apart. They're a lot more irregular. They're not as symmetrically shaped, say, as the ones in the big carapace on the back. But he can't like fold his neck in the way that turtles can. He can't pull his head all the way into his shell. But he can kind of lower it down, especially if we think he's got great little claws there for digging, which again also would have had that keratin sheath around the outside. So he could maybe dig a little shallow impression and hunker down into that and just pull his head kind of back and down and be very well protected, which is why our cat here, this is Xenosmilus, not Smilodon, so he's kind of like a false saber tooth, you might say. But in any case, he's not trying to bite through or eat that shell, right? That's gonna break his teeth. What he's actually trying to do, because cats are very curious, is roll it over. And once you get these guys onto their backs, almost certainly at your mercy, which again, when you got predators, very smart individuals like humans showing up, it's probably a pressure that these guys are unprepared for.
Right. Now I'm noticing on his skull here.
Yes. That thing right there, that's a big projection off of his zygomatic arch. That's his cheekbone right there, more or less. And when we look at things like the zygomatic arch in this area of the skull, what we're looking at is chewing muscles, right? That's an attachment for how we're moving that jaw. And if you look at that big, broad back portion there as well, we got a lot of chewing power in there. So he is able to just shred those plants and just, you know, absolutely power through the vegetation would be how I'd put it.
Its teeth are very short teeth. I imagine the PSI or the bite force, however you want to measure it, newtons, is quite extreme. If you got your hand in there.
Oh, I mean, I certainly wouldn't put my fingers in his mouth.
No, he wouldn't even notice it.
And what's really kind of neat is these guys, not unlike rodents, the whole group, the Xenarthrans, including the giant ground sloths, have constantly growing teeth throughout their life. Hypsodon, I believe, is going to be the proper term for that. So when we look at the bottoms of them, they're completely open inside that jaw because they're basically constantly replacing those teeth throughout their life so they can wear them down as they're eating through all that tough vegetation. Especially if you think about the amount of silica in grasses, it wears teeth down like nobody's business.
It's like just chewing on sandpaper.
More or less.
Your food is just sandpaper. Beavers.
Constantly growing teeth as well. Yeah, part of that rodent group that have that same adaptation.
Because they're chomping on wood and bark the whole time, wearing it down the whole time.
Oh gosh, yeah, it's really tough material to have to work through. And again, that's part of that arms race between vegetation and animals, right? If you think about woody, the lignin that these plants are building, it helps them to get up and hold their weight, but it also makes it really tough to break down, which is why you have to be specialized, like a beaver or like a termite or something, to be able to break down that wood.
Right. I reminded Ryan in a recent video, in the petrified wood, he mentions there's no such thing as trees. It's basically plants that just adapted different.
Tree is a way of being, it's a shape of life, not a classification or a group that we can traditionally think about, right? Yeah, the palm trees are actually grasses, which is just mind-blowing, absolutely.
And it makes sense. See, I like learning mind-blowing things like that, because when you start putting two and two together, it starts making sense. The blades of a palm and the blades of grass, oh, well then it totally is like a little bulb of grass that said, hey, I'm getting eaten, I'm gonna go up.
Yeah, gotta get higher, gotta get away from all this stuff down here. Yeah.
Why do we think how do I pronounce it? Glyptodon. Why do we think Glyptodon went extinct? Do we have any evidence of how that could have happened?
It's probably the same sort of explanations that I give for all the big animals we're losing across North and South America, and really across the world in the end Pleistocene, is that we had this megafauna mass extinction. And a lot of people like to point the finger at human beings because we're showing up on the scene at the time. And we probably, I don't doubt we played a role, right? We did have an effect on these ecosystems, there's no doubt. Well, we're like any animal. Every animal has an impact on its environment. You don't exist in a bubble. Yeah. But do I think humans were solely at fault? Probably not. There's also a pretty significant climate change event going on at the time. We had these massive changeover in the ecological, the plant communities at the time. Grasses were coming to dominate across huge swaths of Eurasia and North America when they hadn't necessarily previously. And that there was also a big changeover in the animal communities as well. Bison only really showed up here in North America, this most iconic animal, about 150,000 years ago. So it was actually relative to a lot of these other animals like horses and camels and things, and even the ground sloths and the armadillos, which have been here for much longer time periods, they were relatively recent arrivals. And they were very successful grazers, and they probably had maybe something to do with that rapid expansion of grasslands, right? That they maybe helped to kind of create the favorable conditions for those grasslands by browsing down all this other vegetation so low down that the only thing that could survive were grasses. Do I think bison were responsible for the extinction of these guys? Probably not. Do I think climate change was solely responsible for the extinction of these guys? Probably not. Do I think humans were the sole explanation for these guys going extinct? Probably not. It's probably all of these things hitting at the same time, a little column A, a little column B. Who's mainly at fault? I don't know if we're ever going to be, that debate will ever really be settled. But
and is it, now you could say humans definitely were at fault for the bison and the dropping numbers of.
Oh yeah, in the historic period,
certainly,
no doubt, no doubt.
But over the time of Earth, the beginning of the Earth, and to where we are now, when people think about extinction events, the first thing that pops, I guarantee you, extinction event, you're thinking of the asteroid that hit the Earth in this kind of. Which even that wasn't,
The asteroid didn't kill all the dinosaurs itself. It's not as though it hit the entire planet and leveled the surface and killed every individual dinosaur itself, but it was the end result of the effect it had on the climate that ultimately really did end the dinosaurs.
When any alteration to the food chain,
if it's significant enough,
the sun. It all starts with the sun. If you blot out the sun, which is what the asteroid did, then you are going to affect the food chain, plankton, plants, all that stuff the
basis that everything relies on, is disrupted.
So after the asteroid impact, the Chicxulub asteroid, a lot of creatures certainly died that first day.
The tsunamis, the fires, all that stuff. Yeah.
But the extinction, even after that, the effects of that extinction event isn't just the day.
It took hundreds of years, thousands of years probably to really have its full effects felt, and finally to lose the last of so many of those species that are going to go extinct as a result of that impact.
Right, and that was a quick extinction event.
Relatively, absolutely.
Relatively. Yeah. Most extinction events
take probably thousands to tens of thousands of years.
Maybe even millions of years for a species to just dwindle away. Megalodon, I think, is a kind of a good example of that. debate, some people, Megalodon's still out there.
2 million years, 3 million years, when does it disappear? Is it still here today? Yeah.
But sharks and the Meg and the relatives of Meg go back 100 million years or whatever.
Oh man, more like 400 almost. It's, at least
so the
back
extinction
to
of Megalodon wasn't an overnight thing. And what caused Megalodon to go extinct, the theory is that it's the food supply.
And changes in the ocean temperature more than anything. And yes, I don't think Megalodon is still here. I'm very relieved by that. I'm pretty sure they're extinct. But
now great white sharks can still, that's the thing.
Yeah, still
not
terrifying.
Every Megalodon was a 60-foot long
monster,
beast.
right?
Most Megalodons probably died
20, 30 feet maybe, or maybe the babies that were 6 feet long. Yeah.
In fully grown adult white territory. So like, just because Megalodons, it's not like you can go out in the ocean and be like, phew. Now, I don't want to paint a bad picture on sharks. Sharks get a really bad rap. We are way worse to sharks than sharks are
to humans.
Your dog at home, this is a quick little side note. You are, I did a podcast on this a while back on sharks, and your likelihood of being killed by the shark, let me put it this way. Your puppy at home, you are is like 10 or 20 times more likely to be killed by not any of your aggressive breeds of dogs. Any dog is more likely to kill you on your couch than a shark when you go to the beach. Like we have this fear because of Jaws and the myth and all that kind of stuff. So even if Megalodon was here, it's not like you're going to swallow thousands of people whole.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly wouldn't be as safe to go in the ocean, but...
But my point, so back to the kind of the point here is extinction events over time, excluding the Chicxulub asteroid, they pan out over many
tend to play
years,
out over long periods of time.
Maybe. And that could be just...
Oh, yeah, I mean...
The competition. You mentioned I'm sorry to cut you off, but the
Isthmus of Panama forming.
Panama.
Yeah.
That was probably played a role in the extinction of a lot of creatures. Now you're mixing creatures, like in Jurassic Park, they say.
Exposing them to new environments, and new animals, new competitors, new predators.
Who's going to survive in that process of extinction for whatever creatures died after that land bridge opened up? Again, it
doesn't qualify as a mass extinction, but there are, of course, so many other minor extinction events that have occurred across the history of the planet beyond the 5 big ones we talk about.
There's creatures going extinct today.
Absolutely.
That have been around for hundreds of thousands, millions of years, and there's creatures going extinct today that we never even had a chance to discover.
We don't have any knowledge of,
Which is crazy, especially in the bottom of the oceans. But extinction events typically are way
more protracted than what we tend to picture them as, absolutely. Of course, people ask like, oh, why did armadillos get small? Well, we had small armadillos as well as the big ones who all came north. It's the big ones, again, who tend to go extinct. Smaller species tend to be more adaptable and thus have lower needs, lower caloric requirements. So they tend to survive those extinction events much better.
And there's a smaller armadillo back
here. Yeah, the Holmesina there is still pretty big,
but
not big compared to this guy, right?
Yeah,
this guy is described as Volkswagen size, the bug.
This guy's probably is the size of a golden retriever.
Oh yeah, certainly a medium-sized dog. Yeah, I love those Holmesina too. All the Xenarthrans are close and near and dear to my heart.
So the armadillos we know and love. Well, some people don't love armadillos because they wreak a lot of havoc in
gardens and things like that. Yeah.
But they burrow
underground. Mm-hmm.
That's this guy doesn't look like he has any adaptation towards going underground. Completely. I'm sure maybe they dug holes and pits and things like that.
Yeah, but he's not going to be able to, with those arms, necessarily be able to dig a burrow or a tunnel large enough necessarily to accommodate his whole size. Perhaps. But they've got the good, lovely armor on the outside to protect him anyway, so do they necessarily need to sleep underground?
They have
Maybe
to
not.
grow.
Yeah.
But they're big, they're exposed, and that could be
another reason why they were vulnerable and potentially susceptible to extinction. Yeah.
And we all know how clever, this is a good way to, let's just kind of end the podcast here, because I got to pick up my son also.
Oh yeah.
It's all good. We all know how clever cats are, to the bane of our existence sometimes.
I've got a kitten that's making my life a living heck at home with my poor house plants.
What is the name of your kitten?
Oh, kitten is Taki.
Taki?
Yep. He was the spiciest of the litter, apparently. He came with the name.
So I have 2 cats. What a weird way to end a podcast.
Segue.
2 cats, adopted cats. I didn't adopt these cats, but they came with my wife.
They adopted you.
Yeah. Jack, which is short for Jack A.S. fill in the blank. And then Sassy. There's no wondering about Sassy. She's just a sassy one.
Mm-hmm.
And Jack is that name because he is just, I don't like him. Anyone want Jack? You don't want Jack. But Taki was the spiciest cat in the litter.
But very clever.
Very
obviously.
clever. So, and there are lots of cats, and we still have tigers and lions, and they are smart. They're thinking. I think about Jurassic Park and the raptors. Oh, clever girl. These cats are not. They're poking. They're looking for the opening.
Exploring anything and everything. Yeah.
I'm sure Taki, they like bat cups and glasses off counters, and they're just kind of figuring out what happens here if I
does
do
this move?
thing?
What happens if? Yeah, absolutely.
Now imagine Taki, 700 pounds, going after an ancient armadillo.
Yeah, and certainly this animal
day out.
has lots of protections. He does have that big old tail back there. That is an attack back sort of thing. That is definitely
he has some defense.
An offensive weapon as well as defensive. But I mean, if you simply avoid that tail, it's still sort of a very vulnerable target.
That's what I'm saying. Cats are clever, even with that big club.
Yeah.
The cat will figure out
a way to
let's
avoid
stay
it.
away. Let's stay away from back there. Let's maybe make our strategy towards the front or stay on the sides out of the way of the tail. And maybe it could be a pack of these cats all working kind of together to disorient.
Possibly. I mean, certainly that's a tactic
on.
we see amongst modern African lions. So, and it's been proposed for Smilodon as well, since we see individuals with broken sabers surviving well after that should supposedly impede their ability to hunt. If those sabers are the only way they take down and kill their prey, if those get broken, then they should starve to death. But we see individuals that survive those sorts of injuries. So
I guess I would lend credence to being packed.
Provisioned, being able to give, food even if they can't hunt it themselves.
And we talked about that in a previous podcast where, what was the term for it? Where you study modern animals.
Actualism, looking at modern animals to better understand those in the past.
So when we talk about ancient animals like these extinct animals and we speculate and hypothesize on their behavior, it's not just somebody making it up.
Off the top of their head, it's based in observations of modern living animals.
Right. Why would a modern animal, there's going to be different behaviors and different
Absolutely,
adaptations.
Depending on the sorts of situations, the conditions they find themselves in, they're always going to have differences. But
there's reasonable hypotheses you can determine about an ancient animal based on a modern animal and how it operates in a similar environment to where these died off, and you can kind of start connecting the dots.
Absolutely.
Were we there to see exactly a saber-toothed cat going after a giant Glyptodon? People want to say glyph like hieroglyph, but Glyptodon. No, we weren't. Colin and I weren't there. We didn't have our 4K YouTube cameras to
document the whole thing.
This is exactly what. Yeah. But that's what's fun about science. That's what's fun about exercising your brain and actualism, looking at modern animals and coming to...
Take the evidence you have and see where it takes you. See what you can learn from it and what you can extrapolate out.
And then peer review it and see if...
Test it. Here's
what I'll end with. And it's not much to do with any specific animal we talked about. But a while back in 2002, I went on a fossil dig in Wyoming with the adult education program. I made a whole documentary about it on YouTube. Go check it out. It's called In Our Bones. And I kicked up, it was just in the, what do you call it? The
spoil or
the spoil?
The float on the surface.
And I said, this looks kind of like a fossil. And I did the little spit test, and like this, to me, a complete layman, is a few days into it, so I was starting to learn what to look for.
Yeah.
So I didn't gather, there were several professional paleontologists there. I didn't get them all in one group and say, what do y'all think this is? I went to them individually first.
You ran an experiment.
What do you think? Without a blind experiment on all of that. Blind. What do you think? What do you think? And then at the end, they all said the same thing. And then I got them all together. What y'all said this is, y'all think that this is this, which they think it was a partial rib bone from a barosaur, because that's what we were finding nearby, and that's what the marks and indentations, and it looked like it was like a 2-inch square piece.
About the right shape,
So we had 7 or 8 professionals who individually said it was one thing, and then together they all agreed, it's probably this one thing, so it probably is a rib cage from the barosaur. And I was all excited.
So yeah, that's how we more or less reached consensus in science. As we all agree what we're looking at is probably the thing we think it's going to be.
And I was like, oh, I got this super special thing. They're like, yeah, it's cool because of what it is. But
yeah, fossil bone is always going to be exciting because it's evidence of past life. But you can't necessarily learn that much from just a small rib fragment from those really big animals, unfortunately. It's still very, very cool.
We have plenty of access to Barosaur.
Full ribs more, hopefully.
So they're like, I was like, can I keep it? And they're like, yeah, you can keep it.
Especially if it's coming off the spoil pile. It's already been disturbed. That's not a problem.
Yeah, and they know where it is. If
anybody desperately needed it, yeah.
Yeah, I've got it. I also have a little 2 or 3 inch megalodon tooth.
Lovely.
That I got from a meg diver who was here recently.
Was that JP?
Yeah.
Yeah, I hear all about him. I haven't met him myself, unfortunately.
Now, it's not a super impressive meg specimen because it's not as big as the palm of your hand or anything like that.
It wasn't the biggest meg that ever lived, no.
No, but it's a meg tooth.
It's super
cool.
And
I use it to open Amazon boxes, which may be sacrilege, but...
Hey, there is some evidence of ancient Native Americans repurposing those megalodon teeth as tools or decorative objects themselves. So you're just carrying on a tradition that's been in existence for hundreds, if not thousands of years.
And you know that I feel like some people have asked me, wouldn't it kind of be humiliating to be used in that way, 5 million years after you died or whatever? In my brain, this is my personal opinion, if someone's still getting use out of me, if I'm still be useful after 5 million years... Well,
not to mention that somebody is taking the time to recover part of that animal, to think about it and appreciate it. I would think that animal would probably, hopefully, be understanding and appreciative of it in turn.
Now, if meg teeth were rarer, I would not use it to open an Amazon box. But it's not it's a special specimen to me. The scientific community thinks it's cool, but it's not like...
It's not something that they're going to... they're going to lose.
Teeth, so it hasn't really offended too many people that I open my new battery charger for my camera.
I'll still talk to you, Johnny, I swear.
It's okay. Thank you all so much for listening to the HMNS Beyond Bones podcast. Colin, thank you so much for
my pleasure.
being on again today.
Thank y'all so much for listening to another episode of the HMNS Beyond Bones podcast, presented by the Houston Museum of Natural Science. I'm your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger, reminding you to follow us on social media, come see us at the museum, of course, and as always, stay safe and stay curious.